Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us for our Emerging Civil War Virtual Symposium here from Stevenson Ridge. I'm Chris White. I'm the co-founder of Emerging Civil War, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who is a household name to most people at Emerging Civil War, because that is our editor-in-chief, Chris Mackowski. Chris is a longtime friend. We just figured out today that we've known each other now for 16 years. And in that time, we've almost written one book per year for knowing each other. So we're working our way towards having a book per year for it. Chris is a prolific author. He has written a number of books with me, without me, and with other people as well. And he's also the editor-in-chief of Emerging Civil War, the Emerging Civil War series, and our Engaging the Civil War series with Southern Illinois University Press. So Chris is going to speak to us today about Ulysses S. Grant and his final battle, which most people don't realize was a battle with death as he raced towards his own demise, unfortunately for him. So without further ado, I'm going to give you Chris Mackowski, Editor-in-Chief of Emerging Civil War.
Thanks for joining us. I want to say thanks to Chris for the introduction, as well as for the work he's doing behind the camera today. We'll see if I can do this. I promised folks I would stay behind a podium today, and folks who know me know that I tend to roam and use the room, so we'll see how this goes today. There will be no turning back, Ulysses S. Grant said in the spring of 1864, as he and the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River to open the spring campaign. He'd recently been named commander of all Union armies and had decided to tag along with the Army of the Potomac to give it a little inspiration. This was a motto that had guided him his entire life. Late in life, he wrote about a habit he had as a boy, a superstition that when he went someplace, if he missed the turn, rather than double back, he would continue onward and come in the other direction because he did not believe in turning back. And in the spring of '64, he held true to that philosophy, engaging with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, first in the Wilderness, and then to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and then to the North Anna River, then to Totopotomoy Creek, to Cold Harbor, across the James River to Petersburg, and a 9-month siege that led inexorably to Appomattox Courthouse. There would be no turning back. After the surrender of Lee at Appomattox, the road led Grant to 2 terms in the White House, 8 total years where he presided over the nation that he had saved. After that, he decided to take a round-the-world trip with his wife, 2.5 years as the most famous American, traveling the world as a goodwill ambassador for America. But partway across the sea, he realized he was running out of money. But rather than turn back, he wired to his son for financial reinforcements. The bank account was saved. Grant and his wife, Julia, adjusted their living accommodations and traveled onward in more modest means and continued around the world, spreading goodwill for America. Upon returning to the United States, he settled in to a new financial institution in New York City, the firm of Grant and Ward, and there he made his life as a businessman. His political supporters wanted to get him a 3rd term in the White House, but overconfidence led them to bungle his nomination, and Grant said, "Just as well, I have no need to return to public life. I'm tired of the abuse." Even in politics, there would be no turning back. Several times people had asked him to write his memoirs, talking about his adventures in the Army, his adventures in the war, his adventures in politics. But again, he didn't feel the need to return to those adventures. There would again be no turning back. It's all in Badow, he said, referring to the 3-volume military history of Ulysses S. Grant, written by his former aide, Brigadier General Adam Badow. And so Grant's life would have continued onward as the great statesman of the age, the most famous American in the world, except for a peach. And because of that peach, life would change dramatically for Ulysses S. Grant. And he would indeed find himself turning back after all, in a race against the clock with the ultimate deadline. To understand why this peach plays such an important role, we have to begin in May of 1884, exactly 20 years to the day when the Army of the Potomac began to rumble forth from its winter camps around Culpeper. On that day, a Sunday, Grant was at home in his townhouse at East 66th Street in New York when he got a knock on the door from one of his business partners, the 30-year-old Ferdinand Ward, the young Napoleon of Wall Street. Ward was one of 4 partners in the financial firm of Grant and Ward, and he was the financial mastermind. The other partner, James Fish, president of Marine Bank, and Grant's younger son, Buck. And together, those 3, along with Grant, ran this firm. Grant did nothing but lend his name and the prestige of it to the firm. His son, Buck, ran the day-to-day operations. Fish oversaw the deposits and finances, and Ward himself oversaw the investments. Nobody knows it at the time, but Ward is actually a sociopath, and he will spend the remainder of his life cheating and conniving. But as he stood there on the porch in the brownstone at East 66th Street, he looked the picture of sincerity. And as he was ushered into Grant's parlor, he explained the situation, pulling up a chair and talking to Grant. It seems as though Marine Bank is short $400,000 because of some government withdrawals. Now, Grant said, that sounds terrible, but why is that of concern to us? And Ward said, well, see, our money is deposited in Marine Bank. And should they not be able to open their doors on Monday, it would be of great embarrassment to our firm. Now, I've managed to come up with $250,000 to cover the shortfall, but we're still $150,000 short. Do you think that you could come up with that money? And Grant thought about it for a moment, and he said he'd see what he could do. And so he's going to then go about town to see if he can find that $150,000. Here we see Ward himself, again, the young, innocent-looking fellow. We're going to see just how uninnocent he is. And I juxtapose him against William Vanderbilt. In an age of crazy beards, Vanderbilt's got one of the craziest. And I show his picture just because his beard is so crazy. But he's the richest man in the world. And Grant goes to him first. They're friends. And he explains the situation calmly, coolly. And Vanderbilt says, well, I don't really care about Marine Bank. I don't really even care about Grant and Ward. But you, General Grant, I care about. And so he got out his checkbook and he wrote a check for $150,000 payable personally to Ulysses S. Grant. And he says, I consider this a personal loan to you and no one else. And Grant happily accepts it. It's a loan. He says things will be squared away in just a couple days. It's a cash flow issue, and he thanks his friend. A business deal. He goes, he gives the money to Ward, who says, thank you very much. I'll take care of this. Things will be fine on Monday. And indeed, on Monday morning, things seem to be okay. But by Monday afternoon, Grant's son Buck is starting to get a little suspicious. Ward's been acting a little cagey. And so that evening, Buck and his attorney go to Ward's house to just kind of explore the situation just a little bit more. And they get there, and Ward's wife greets them at the door, and she says, well, he's not here, but I'll have him come see you as soon as he gets home. And Buck and the attorney sit, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. They wait for 5 hours. They wait until after midnight, and finally Ward shows up at the door of the parlor, and he says, oh, I'm so sorry to keep you waiting. What's the problem? And Buck explains what's going on, and Ward says, well, everything should be fine. And the attorney says, well, listen, maybe you would then be willing to write a check to cover the investment of my clients. And, oh, absolutely, Ward says. And he signs his check and he passes it over. Take it to Marine Bank in the morning. They'll be able to get you your money. Everything will be fine. So that next morning, Grant happens to give an interview to the newspaper from St. Louis, one of his hometown newspapers. It's where his wife is from. He and his wife had lived there for a number of years. And he said, the whole state of the country seemed to be wonderful, he said. He was literally riding on top of the world. But when he got to work, he saw a crowd gathered in front of the office. And his son, Buck, besieged by angry investors who are yelling, screaming. And Buck sees his father and he says that Marine Bank has closed its doors. No one can find Ward, and the key to the safe is missing. The bottom is out of the tub. Grant, distressed by this news, pushes his way through the crowd and into the office and goes to his second floor office, sits down behind his desk, and he notices that for the first time in years, the top of the desk is clean. Ward had made a daily habit of coming in and laying out 20 cigars on Grant's desk each day. Cigar smoking was a habit that Grant had picked up pretty much during the Civil War following the Battle of Fort Donelson, when a newspaper report talked about him puffing on a cigar on the way to battle. And people began sending him cigars from all across the country. Grant had been a pipe smoker up to that point, but switches over to cigars. And throughout the war, he puffs on as many as 20 cigars a day. In civilian life, he says that he cuts back to 8 or 10 a day, but he's used to having them laid out on his desk, and there's nothing there. And he sits there staring at that empty surface, thinking about this news that has come to him and the angry crowd out front. And as additional news comes up to him over the course of the day and things get worse and worse, and he realizes just how bleak the situation is. And in fact, it's going to be so bad, but by the time the red ink stops flowing, Grant and Ward will be out $16.8 million. Grant's wife later says, imagine the shock to us, we who thought we were independently wealthy. We were thunderstruck, she said, to find out that in fact we're destitute. Ward had been running what today we would call a Ponzi scheme, where he takes money from Chris, and he takes money from Stewart, and he takes money from Terry, and then takes some of Terry's money and gives it back to Chris. And Chris is like, oh, wow, fantastic. I'm already getting a return on my investment. So he invests more. And then Ward will give some of that to Stewart, who's like, this is great. The firm had actually been giving return on investment as high as 20%. It was an invitation to print money, and they had the highest bond rating available on Wall Street. It was a surefire bet. But really, as Ward later said, he was robbing Peter to pay Paul. And suddenly, everything collapses, and the firm is out. And when word gets out, in fact, there is a collapse on Wall Street, a stock market collapse that results from this. And everyone turns to Grant. And of course, because of his stature, because of his position as former president, because of his position as former general, he's got a lot of enemies who are quick to make hay of this. And they start talking about Grant being a swindler and the perfidy. And to a man of Grant's integrity, this is a terrible blow. It quickly becomes apparent that Grant actually had nothing to do with it. He would sit at his desk, and Ward would slide in with some papers and say, here, sign this, and Grant would put his name on it, and off it would go. And that was the extent of Grant's involvement, which Ward freely admits. As soon as he's caught, he caves, and he fesses up to the whole thing. So then the headlines change from Grant being an evil swindler to, oh, well, was he negligent? Was he inept? Was he criminally negligent? And this again is a terrible blow to Grant. When he goes home to break that news to his wife, Julia, she's got $130 in the cookie jar. He's got $80 in his pocket, and that is all they have to their name. And suddenly they've got to figure out what they're going to do, and they begin to start to sell off properties that they own. Grant tries to mortgage his house to cover the $150,000 that he just borrowed from Vanderbilt, only to discover that they don't actually own their house. The attorney who had handled the deal was Ferdinand Ward, and he had taken just enough money to leverage that mortgage so the Grants could move in and take possession, and he swindled away the rest. So now they don't even own their own home, and they've got to figure out what are they going to do. And as it turns out, the one property they're able to take advantage of is a cottage, which is a modest term for this large structure at Long Branch, New Jersey, at the Jersey Shore. The reason they move there, it sounds like an act of luxury, but the reason they move there is because they can't sell the house at market value to make any sort of profit that would allow them to actually pay off the house. And so since they can't find a renter, they move in. Grant's oldest son, Fred, moves in with them. He has also lost everything. Julia finds a silver lining to the entire episode and says that it was a blessing to have her grandchildren around her. If there was any good that came of the incident, that was it. And there, Grant is going to hunker down and battle depression and try to figure out how to recover from this incredible financial disaster. As he is trying to figure things out, a lot of people want to take up collections. They want to give him money, and he won't accept charity. Ithaca, New York tries a subscription drive where people are asked to donate $1 apiece to raise money. But Grant's pride won't let him take charity. He gets $500 in the mail from a man named Charles Wood of Lansingburg, New York. Wood was an industrialist during the Civil War, and he says, "This payment is due for services rendered on April 9th, 1865, a reference to Grant's forced surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. And Wood says, "Consider this a loan repayable at your convenience." And because it's couched in those terms, Grant will accept it with the expectation and intent that he's going to pay it back. It's his expectation, not Wood's. And so he sends a note to Wood saying, "Thank you so much. You have no idea how helpful this was." And so Wood sends him another $1,000. And Grant, again, acknowledges the gift and says that he promises that he's going to repay this. He intends to repay every single dollar he owes everybody. Vanderbilt, for his part, wants to just excuse the debt. He wants to forgive it. And Grant won't let him. And in fact, Grant will take Vanderbilt to court to force Vanderbilt to enforce the loan. You know, and Vanderbilt's like, what? But Grant, as a man of honor, realizes it's his obligation to fulfill these debts. So as he's trying to figure out what to do and how to cover those debts, in comes Robert Underwood Johnson. He's an editor at the Century magazine. And Century wants to launch a new series of articles by the premier participants of the late war, as they describe it. First-person accounts that share their experiences. The ultimate collection becomes what we know today as Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, one of the great resources that we as historians have to rely on these first-person accounts. Johnson wants to get the preeminent people. And of course, at this point, 1884, the preeminent survivor is Grant himself. Of course, Lincoln doesn't survive the war. By this point, Robert E. Lee has passed away. Grant's still the great general, the great survivor. And as early as 1883, they'd actually approached Grant and asked him, like, "Hey, would you be interested in doing some writing for us?" And Grant said, "No, there'll be no turning back. It's all in Badow." And that really let the air out of this great idea. They're like, "Oh, gosh, well, if Grant doesn't write, is anybody else going to want to grab?" You know, like, they're counting on his prestige to help bolster the series. And if he doesn't want to do it, gosh. Well, that was January of 1884. Well, now, with Grant's financial situation changed, Johnson thinks, let's try it again. And they send off a note to Grant, who says, "Yes, I'd be glad to talk to a representative. Why don't you send somebody out?" And so Johnson comes to Long Branch. And when he gets there, he says that Grant had the air about him of a wounded lion. But that Grant was very talkative, very frank, very open about what had happened to him. And as the two of them talk, they come to an agreement that Grant will write some stories for the Century for $500 apiece. Grant sees this as a way for him to earn money so that he can start to repay some of these debts and support his family. At first, they're going to write about Shiloh, they're going to write about Vicksburg, they're going to write about the wilderness, and they're going to write about Appomattox Courthouse. Although after Johnson gets back to the office, Grant writes to him and says, I want to swap out Appomattox for Chattanooga, which I think is a fascinating decision. Johnson's colleagues are like, no, we want Appomattox. Isn't that the most important thing? And Johnson's like, hey, let's just let him write what he wants to write about and be happy with what we get. As historians, of course, we naturally gravitate to what happened at Appomattox? Let's get inside your head. But the fact that Grant thought Chattanooga was more important than Appomattox, that he wanted to feature that he wanted to highlight that, I think says a lot about, helps us understand Grant in some pretty important ways, really worth diving into. And so Grant sets to work writing this story. Now, he wasn't sure anybody would want to read his story. And in the wake of the financial disaster, he's incredibly embarrassed. He doesn't think anybody wants to, not only does nobody want to read his story, but they all think he's a crook. They think he's a criminal. But one thing that really changes his perspective happens at Memorial Day, that end of that May. And Phil Sheridan is the Grand Marshal of the Memorial Day Parade in Brooklyn. And he invites Grant to come along to be co-marshal. And Grant, he's a little worried about going out into public. But hundreds of thousands of people show out for this parade, and they cheer wildly when they see Grant. And so he realizes that maybe he does not have reason to be embarrassed as people are seeing what the facts of the case are. They realize that he's a victim as well, and that he can still hold his head up in front of his men. And for him, that is incredibly important. Later in the summer, he's invited to the convention of the Grand Army of the Republic, where they elect him president of the GAR. And instead of the traditional 3 cheers, they give him 3 sets of cheers. 9 cheers that echo so loud from the convention hall that one reporter down the block said that they could hear the reverberations throughout the city from the cheers of acclaim for Grant. And then one other significant event happens that summer that really helps Grant reassess his position. He's actually invited to speak to a reunion of the United States Christian Commission, which is having its reunion there just down the road from him at the Jersey Shore. And so he takes a trip down there, and 10,000 people under this grand tent. And as he's talking to them about the great acts of mercy that he saw the U.S. Christian Commission perform during the war, and he starts to get choked up, and he can't finish his speech. He's overcome with emotion. And he admits later that to be there in front of those angels of the battlefield, they, if anyone, if they forgave him, then perhaps he was worthy of forgiveness. And so these are the things that help Grant recover from this financial loss. And he's got this writing project to now focus him and help him earn some money. And so he'll begin writing, and he sends off within just a couple weeks the first account of the Battle of Shiloh. And Johnson gets it, and it is so terrible that he calls it the second disaster of Shiloh. And he's not sure what he's going to do because it's boring. It is just absolutely boring. It is dry. It reads like an official report. And as he tries to figure out how to salvage the situation, he decides he's going to ride down to Long Branch and talk to Grant personally about this. And when he gets there, rather than take the letter out and kind of go through it, he sits down with Grant on the veranda and he says, before we talk about the story, just tell me about the Battle of Shiloh. And Johnson later writes that Grant, who was normally known for being reserved, proved quite loquacious as he told about his own accounts and his own perspectives of Shiloh. And Johnson says, that is what I want right there. I want you to write down this story as though you're sitting across the dinner table telling a friend. And Johnson later said that Grant immediately grasped what was necessary for a work of public consumption. They didn't even end up having to talk about the story at all as Grant had written it. And Grant immediately said, I've got some ideas. And so On the 3rd of July, Johnson gets a revision, and it is fantastic. He is delighted. It needs a couple nips and tucks here and there, just for style and grammar, but he says it was nearly perfect. And Grant, also pleased with the outcome, sets to work on the next piece. In the meantime, Grant reaches out to his former aide, Adam Badow, and he says, look, I'm doing this writing about the war, and Grant's unsure of himself as a writer. He's never thought of himself as a writer, but Badow had once been a literary critic for the New York Times, had been a theater critic for him, was friends with John Wilkes Booth once upon a time, actually. And Badow's a professional author now, and so Grant's like, as I work on these, I'm wondering if I could show them to you just to get your professional opinion. And Badow says, sure. And I think about Badow's decision here because Badow is the guy who's written the officially sanctioned history of Grant during the war. It's all in Badow, Grant said. And now Grant wants to write about the war. So Grant's going to write something that's going to undercut Badow. Grant asks for Badow's help to do it. And Badow says yes. And I want you to keep that in mind as our story progresses, because Badow's an interesting character in this whole episode. So Badow's actually going to move in with the family as everyone gets resituated at the townhouse back in Manhattan. They get the mortgage thing squared out because Grant is going to take all of the treasures that were given to him, all the gifts given to him on his round-the-world trip, and use that to bond the mortgage of the house so that the loan to Vanderbilt is covered. Vanderbilt still wants us at this point to just all go away, but Grant is insistent on making sure that he's going to cover this loan. So they get resituated back in the house. Badow moves into a room at the top of the stairs, and he and Grant will then go back and forth as Grant pushes through on the wilderness. He's going to work on Vicksburg, and off he goes. And it's going to be a close working collaboration. And so this is how the story would have ended if not for the peach. Grant would have happily written these stories for Century Magazine, eventually deciding, hey, this would make a great book, and write his memoirs, and off things might go from there. But there's the matter of that peach. It was early June, and Grant had been out on the veranda of the cottage at Long Branch, and been working, and he came back inside, and Julia in her memoir says that there was a basket of fruit on the table, fresh fruit, of which the general was very fond. And he picked up the peach because he wanted one of the dainty morsels. And it's like something in that peach stung him. And it was just terrible stinging in the back of his throat. And he walks up and down the piazza, and he tries to drink some water to wash it down. And then he says, drinking water was like drinking fire. He later says that if you can imagine what it's like to drink molten lead, that is what drinking water is like for me. It becomes the most painful thing in his life. And Julia is shocked. And she wants him to go see the doctor. And in true soldier fashion, Grant's like, rub some dirt in it and walk it off. He wraps a scarf around his neck for a little counter pressure, and he goes back to working, trying to write one of his stories. And Julia's like, well, what? Grant comes to dinner that night. He can't eat. His throat's still bothering him. Julia really kind of urges him to go see a doctor, and he won't. Their friend George Childs, a newspaper publisher from Philadelphia, has a cottage right next door. And as it happens, Childs' doctor is visiting from Philadelphia. So Julie's like, can you come over here and look at my husband's throat? And the doctor comes over, and Grant's like, okay, fine. And the doctor takes a look, and he's not sure he likes what he sees. And he says, you ought to go get that checked out. But here's a little prescription for some pain. And Grant says, okay, I'll go see my doctor. I promise. Except Grant's doctor happens to be in Europe for the summer. And so it's not until October that Grant's finally able to see his doctor. The fella in the center of the picture at the top, his name's Fordyce Barker, looking very august with his facial hair as well. Barker is glad to see Grant. They're old friends. And when he takes a look at Grant's throat, he's like, I'm not sure I like the looks of that. And he sends him to a throat specialist across town, a guy named John Douglas. Douglas, in the picture that we're looking at here, is in the lower left here, well, lower right. Your left, my left, your right. He's the fella in profile with the big beard. And Grant had known him during the war. Douglas had done some great work as a surgeon during the war. And Douglas looks at Grant's throat. He didn't like what he sees either. And Grant says, "Is it cancer?" Because, Grant's famous, straightforward nature. And Douglas later writes that he knew that if he lied to Grant in that moment, he would never be able to regain Grant's trust. And so he says, yes, epithelial in nature and sometimes curable. Grant says, all right. Douglas says, I want you to come back here twice a day, and I'm going to swab the back of your throat with a topical solution that will help numb the pain, and we'll clean it every day and see what we might be able to do to get this under control. Grant says, okay. And twice a day for 2 weeks, Grant takes the streetcar to Douglas's office. He doesn't tell Julia what's going on, and he gets this treatment. He takes the streetcar because he doesn't want to pay the extra expense of a cab because, of course, they don't have any money. And he doesn't tell Julia what's going on, and finally she's like, what is going on? And she talks to their son, Fred, who's like, I don't know, he doesn't say anything to me. And so they follow Grant to the doctor's one day, and that's when Julia finds out that Grant is having treatments for throat cancer. And of course, she's like, why didn't you tell me? As any wife would be. And Grant's like, I didn't want to panic you. And so this routine will continue every day, twice a day for weeks, as Grant quietly doesn't tell anybody, quietly seeks treatment. In the meantime, Douglas takes a sample and sends it to a friend of his across town, a doctor named George Schrady, and he's the fellow who is in the lower left-hand corner, now that I have my left and right straightened out. He's in the lower left-hand corner with that great little hat. He is a cancer specialist, and as he looks, and he's a microbiologist as well, and as he looks under the microscope at the sample, and Douglas doesn't tell him who the sample is from, and Schrady says, this comes from the back of the throat. It's advanced in nature. Douglas says, well, the patient is General Grant. And Schrady says, General Grant is doomed. Recognizes just how serious this is. And so Grant now has this medical diagnosis that adds some urgency to his writing. By this point, he's well into his series, and he has discovered that he likes writing. He'd never thought of himself as a writer, but now that he's doing it, he has discovered the pride of authorship, and he thinks that maybe, after all, he does have something to say about the war and its meaning. And so he starts to decide, you know what, the magazine articles are great, but I think I have something larger in mind. And he starts thinking about a book. And he starts talking to Century Magazine about writing his memoirs and publishing it in book form. And the Century's like, hey, wow, this will be fantastic. And at this point in the story saunters one of the most colorful characters in American history. And as a novelist, you couldn't write this and get away with it because it seems so wild. But this is where Mark Twain shows up. And I always find it ironic that he's such a colorful character. We know him for his shock of white hair and his big white bushy mustache and his white suits. Grant's granddaughter said that he had an air about him of a man walking into a room without any particular destination in mind as he sauntered about. And as Grant sits down one afternoon with a contract from Century Magazine, Twain saunters in. He had got wind of Grant wanting to write his memoirs, and he wants in on the action. Now, Twain and Grant go back as far as the war. There was a brief meeting when Grant was General-in-Chief of the Army, just to quick in passing. Their first real meeting was when Grant was president, and Twain was working as secretary for the senator from Nevada. And the senator's like, hey, you want to meet the president? So they go and they meet Grant, who's sitting behind his desk with the iron expression of a man who has not smiled in 7 years and does not intend to smile for another 7. And Grant stands up, they shake hands, and Twain, not sure what to say, feeling pretty awkward, and finally he looks at Grant and says, I don't know about you, Mr. President, but I'm a little embarrassed. And Twain later wrote that Grant cracked the hint of a smile 7 years ahead of schedule. And Twain took that as a sign to get out of there while the getting was good. They meet again when Grant has finished his round-the-world trip. And he's come back to the United States, and coming from San Francisco back to the East, he's stopping a lot of places along the way to be honored and feted. And there's going to be a reunion of the Army of the Tennessee, the army that Grant used to lead out in the West, in Chicago. And they've asked Twain to be the keynote speaker at that event, a 3-day festival. So Twain shows up there, and on the first day, the army is passing in review in front of the hotel, and Twain comes out onto the balcony of the hotel to watch, and by this point he's famous. He's had a number of books published. He's one of the most famous men in America. And all of a sudden the crowd cheers. And Twain knows he's not that famous, right? And he looks down the balcony, and Grant has come out onto the balcony to watch his old army pass in review. And of course everyone's all delighted to see their old commander. And Grant sees Twain and comes over and he says, Mr. Clemens, I don't know about you, but I'm not feeling embarrassed. And that instant connection, bringing up that incident, really kind of cemented their bond. So they have 3 great days together, and finally comes the big banquet where Grant is supposed to be honored, and Twain is batting cleanup after a long alcohol-drenched night. It is a position of honor no one has ever asked for, Twain said. And everyone's getting up, and I'd like to propose a toast to this, and I'd like to propose a toast to that, and I'd like to propose this toast. And by the time Twain gets up, he says, we've had the opportunity tonight to remember lots of different people, the officers, the men, the ladies, but let us not forget the babies. And everyone looks like, what is he talking about? And Grant's sort of like, okay. And Twain says, if the child grows up to become the sort of man that Grant has eventually grown up to be, then somewhere out there today is the next Grant. And we don't know who that is or where that child will be, where that next seed of greatness is. But we can be assured that that child is out there. And if, like our esteemed guest, once upon a time, devoted his entire considerable powers of concentration on getting his big toe into his mouth. And the whole room's like, and Twain looks at Grant and says, and if his record of success be any indication, there's no doubt he's succeeded. And Grant burst out laughing, and that lets the room out of the air, because everyone's like, where is he going with this? And Twain later says, I had him right here in the palm of my hand. It's a great night. When Grant eventually gets to New York and sets up shop on Wall Street with Grant and Ward, Twain has got his own business up in Hartford, Connecticut, is often down in the city on publishing business, and so he stops in to see Grant quite often. And they smoke cigars together and spin tales and talk about the Mississippi and all that, writing and all that kind of stuff. And during one of those meetings, Twain brings with him his friend William Dean Howells, who is the editor of Harper's, which becomes, of course, one of the preeminent literary magazines of the age. And they're all talking, and Twain says, you ought to write a book. I could get that book published for you. I know a little something about publishing. And Grant's like, no, it's all in Badow. There's no need to go back to that. And they have a lunch that Twain describes as real camp fare, beans, coffee, having a great old time. And so Twain lets the story drop. Well, now we're in the parlor of Grant's home with a contract on the desk with a Century magazine to write those very memoirs. And Twain feels like he has missed his chance. He says, well, what are you working on there? Grant says, well, got a contract here. And Twain says, well, why don't you have Fred read it out loud to me? I know a little something about publishing. Maybe I can offer you some advice. I think, okay, well, shouldn't hurt. So they start reading it out, and Twain's listening, looking for his opening, and they get to the part about the royalties, which are 10%, pretty standard even today. And Twain says, stop that, scratch that out, and put in 20% instead. In fact, put down 75% of the gross. Grant's like, what publisher is going to pay that? No one would pay that. And Twain says, I know someone who will. And so they start talking, and Twain makes his pitch. And finally, Grant says, well, listen, and I appreciate this, and we're friends, but, Century came to me first, and I feel an obligation. And Twain says, well, if it's a matter of who came to you first, remember that lunch we had with Dean Howells? Grant sets down his pen, and they continue to talk. And Twain says, well, listen, think it over overnight. I'll come back tomorrow. We'll talk some more. And Twain does come back the next day. They talk some more. And Grant says, well, let me talk to my friend George Childs. He's a publisher. And Twain's like, absolutely. I want you to feel comfortable with this. And he's about to leave on a nationwide lecture circuit. And he'll be back. He'll stay in touch via telegram. And Grant can take whatever time he needs. And so Grant checks with Childs, and Childs is like, this is a great deal. If he's really ready to, put his name to this, it's obviously a better deal than Century Magazine. Fred, as Grant's business manager, agrees that this, Twain is the publisher. And to Twain's great credit, he will go to extreme lengths to protect Grant and his project when they finally do decide to have a business agreement. In fact, they'll put the copyright in Julia's name so that it will protect the book from any of Grant's creditors. He will be super generous, and in fact, will offer that 75% of the gross. He'll offer Grant a signing bonus of $50,000, which Grant refuses to take. Grant will accept, I think it's $1,000, which Twain sends over by special courier the day the ink is on the paper. Twain says, how terrible it is that a man who saved the country is reduced to such circumstances that $1,000 is of a considerable comfort to him. And so Grant will then start to work on his book, converting these magazine articles into something larger. But about this time in the fall, he really sinks into depression, and he can't work. He can't concentrate. He can't really bring himself to push forward. The full impact of this diagnosis is coming, settling in on him. He gets the diagnosis in October. By November, he can hardly write. He can hardly move. The only bright spot of his day is when the grandchildren come by on their way to lunch. They'll stop in the door to the office. And when he sees them, he'll beckon them in, and they'll come and they'll swarm all around him. And at first, Julia's like, no, don't interrupt, Grandpa. You can't do that. And she orders the kids not to bother him. And Grant rescinds those orders. He says it's the one bright spot in his day. And Julia starts to get really concerned because Grant can't shake this lethargy. Around Christmas, Grant's going to get a visit from his old-time friend, William T. Sherman. Sherman and Grant have actually grown apart by this time. Sherman really kind of disillusioned with the way Grant has fallen in with the hoity-toity folks of New York. The moneyed class. That wasn't Grant. He's a tanner's son. And so that really kind of bothered Sherman. But he stops by New York because he hears Grant might not be doing so well, and he spends a few days, and they have some great conversation, and Julia expresses her concern to Sherman about Grant, like he hardly even talks anymore. And Sherman explains, Mrs. Grant, you have to remember your husband never had much to say to begin with. And it's almost like she's like, oh, yeah, that's right. And that actually comforts her a great deal. And Sherman talks about how, he used to do the talking for both of them. And Grant would sit there quietly in camp while Sherman paced back and forth, swearing up a storm for the two of them. And the visit seems to do a lot to help Julia, comfort her, and it helps to start to revive Grant's spirit. And he starts thinking about his old Army career, and that kind of gets him up and going on his project. Also, shortly thereafter, another colorful character pops in for a cameo appearance. One of the things I love about this story, you've got a supporting cast that's the Hollywood Walk of Fame of this era. P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman on earth, pops up in this story. He's got a great idea for helping Grant get over his financial woes. What he wants to do is take all of the stuff that Grant has amassed on his world trip and send it on a cross-country tour. People will pay 50 cents a ticket, come in, see Grant's treasures, and it's a way for Grant to honestly earn money to fix his financial situation. And Grant likes the idea a lot, and so he invites Barnum to come, and they talk about it, but Grant says, I don't know if I have the authority to let these items go because I have bounded them to Vanderbilt. To cover this mortgage. And so Barnum's like, okay. Geez, well, if you change your mind, you find anything out. And so Barnum leaves, and that's kind of his point in the story. But he does show up with an attempt to try to help Grant out of his financial mess. Eventually, all of that will get straightened out, and Vanderbilt will take possession of all of those treasures, and they will be assessed conveniently at the cost of $150, or the value of $150,000. So it strikes the loan, everything is square. Vanderbilt turns over that collection to the United States government. You can still see items in the government's collection today. Grant says he's greatly relieved because that's what he would have done with those things upon his own death if they were his to decide. So everything finally gets squared out. But again, no good deed goes unpunished because the press hears this and they think that Vanderbilt's again trying to lean on Grant, and Vanderbilt gets criticized. Every time he tries to do something good in this story, the press twists it on poor Vanderbilt. And so Grant will start writing. Badow will help him with this project. Fred will help him with this project, and he'll push forward. And some days writing as much as 10,000 words. And Twain will stop in and he'll check on things. And he's like, gosh, it kills me to write half that much. And Twain is just amazed at the clarity of Grant's prose. It is a masterpiece, he says. It rivals the Memoirs of Julius Caesar. And the writing is just crisp and clean and smooth, and Grant is enjoying it. Working 6, sometimes 7 days a week, 5, 6, 7, as many as 8 hours a day, depending on the day. He's got a rhythm, a routine, and he's really enjoying it. One other thing that sort of helps during this time is that the financial pressure gets lifted. Grant, when he became president, had to resign his commission from the Army, and that meant he gave up his pension. And at that time, presidents didn't get a pension of their own. And so his supporters in Congress want to reinstate his pension. And it's a bipartisan sort of thing, but there are a few holdouts who are stubbornly kind of refusing to push this bill. Well, on Inauguration Day, Grover Cleveland is about to become president. The House finally passes this resolution after some wrangling. But as the Constitution dictates, there must be a recess before the inauguration. And so they're literally running out of time. Well, the Speaker of the House, who at the time was actually a Democrat, but a close political friend of Grant's, he runs out into the rotunda of the Capitol where the Senate is now milling about, waiting to get into place for the inauguration. And he rounds them all back into the Senate chambers. And the clerk of the Senate climbs up on a chair and turns the Senate clock back 20 minutes so that they have time to vote on Grant's pension and pass it into law. So it gets signed. It'll be the first act that Cleveland is going to enact as his administration. And so Grant will get $20,000 a year, which will go to Julia after his death. They also get an allowance for a horse to take care of their horses. So now the financial pressure is off. Grant has a way to provide for his family after his death. But he keeps writing because he has found that he loves the work and he has something to say. That March, lawyers come to take depositions on the cases of Ferdinand Ward and James Fish. And Grant lets him have it with both barrels, Adam Badow says, who sat in on the meeting. It's a day-long deposition, and Grant just goes at his two former business partners, who will both be convicted. They'll both serve sentences in New York prisons. Ward will eventually bribe his way out of prison so he can watch Grant's eventual funeral, and then goes back into jail. But it's just such an emotional, intense day that Grant's exhausted. And the next day he can't get out of bed, and he starts coughing and starts hacking and is having a really difficult time recovering. And he can't breathe, and he's found that he's exhausted, and his condition deteriorates precipitously to the extent that doctors are suddenly worried that he's not going to recover. And as the days pass and things get more tense, Twain writes in his diary that the whole world began to wait for the pealing of the bells that would announce the death of the great man. The nation holds its breath. People congregate outside the townhouse, holding vigil for Grant. Headlines of the paper say, "Grant is dying." And then one night he has a coughing fit that's especially bad, and he hacks up a whole bunch of mucus and a small fleshy something about the size of a lizard, he later describes, and he's able to breathe again, and that allows him to then get some rest, and he's able to fend off the exhaustion. The next day he actually goes to the window, and he's able to see the crowd, and he waves to them. Big sigh of relief from the crowd. And the next day he's actually feeling well enough to go out for a carriage ride. This is also at the beginning of April at this point. It's Easter, a time of resurrection, certainly for Grant. Also, the 20th anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox is coming up. And at the end of April, Grant's birthday, the 27th. And so there are many occasions for the public to pour out its admiration, its appreciation, and its well wishes to Grant, who gets deluged with correspondence at this time. People wishing him well, people saying thank you, people congratulating him. The nation celebrates Grant this April of 1885. My favorite letter comes from a little girl in Michigan, pretty indicative of the sorts of correspondence he gets, and you'll pardon me for reading it. "I'm a little girl, and I have never been to school, but do my lessons at home with Mama. My reader is Harper's Young People, and this morning I read such a nice story about you. I went down to the newsroom to buy a copy to send to you, but they were all gone. So Mama said I might write to you and tell you if you could not read it yourself, perhaps some of the people who are with you could read it to you. My papa was a soldier and loves you very much, but he is a lawyer now and he does not fight anymore, though Mama says he often fights his old battles over again. He's commander of the GAR post, and last week everybody made speeches about General Lee's surrender to General Grant. I shall send you a birthday card, and it will truly be a present from me. I shall buy it with the money that I have earned. Mama says it's not a real present if you have to ask Papa for the money to buy it with. I shall put my name on it so that you know it's for me, for I suppose you will get a great many. Goodbye, dear General Grant. I love you very much, and I wish I could do something to make you well." Grant gets so many of these letters that he actually issues a public statement and says that even if I was a well man, I could not respond to these great and generous wishes that are sent to me. But please know that I appreciate them, and you're all in my hearts. And so Grant continues working, continues writing, continues his struggle against pain. And then at the very end of April, there's one final twist. A twist of the knife in the back, if you will. Newspaper headline says that Grant is not the author of his memoirs, that it's actually Adam Badow who's ghostwriting them for him. Twain, at his office in Hartford, Connecticut, his head explodes. You can hear it from Manhattan. He threatens to sue. Grant, a little more calmly, sends a note to the paper, a rebuttal, saying, I'm absolutely the author of this, and no one but myself has written this. I've had assistance, but I'm the sole author. And Badow, rather than refute the story, comes in and hands Grant a letter, bows, and leaves. And the letter basically says, if you give me another $10,000, I'll tell everybody that you're the sole author of your memoirs. It just smacks of blackmail. And at this point, Grant is absolutely aghast because he's discovered this pride of authorship. And Badow, who's been helping him, is now changing the rules. And so Grant writes this letter. Like once upon a time, maybe Grant would have been like, oh gosh. Grant lets Badow have it with double barrels this time. And he writes this fabulous letter that's basically like, you're an awful human being, you're prickly, you're arrogant, nobody likes you, not even your mom. People only put up with you because of me, and you're a terrible human being. But if there's anything, and he really ends his letter this way, but if there's anything I can ever do for you, you're always welcome as a guest in my home. It's an incredible letter. And Badow gets fired, and off he goes. And so he will not be here for the end of this story. The story is going to end just north of Saratoga Springs, New York. As Grant continues to write, summer's coming. His doctors think he's got to get out of town so that he can avoid the summer heat. So they make preparations to send him to this resort north of Saratoga Springs. As they're making those final preparations, Memorial Day comes along again, and this time in New York City, the parade route comes right down Broadway, as it normally does, and it takes a detour onto East 66th Street. And there, the Army will pass one final time in front of Grant, who will salute his men one final time. When Grant finally heads north, he'll actually get a special train from his good friend Vanderbilt. And Grant will head north up the Hudson River. It's like a trip back into time. He passes West Point, where he had once been a cadet, and the Corps of Cadets comes out and salutes the train as it goes by. He passes a horse farm in Goshen, where he had his last cigar, and finally gets to Saratoga Springs, where they move him from that train onto a special train up a twisty trail to the top of Mount McGregor. And there, the Drexel family has just built a cottage. They haven't even lived in it yet, and they've offered it to Grant as a place for him to get away and enjoy some cool mountain breezes for the summer. It's next to this luxury hotel called the Balmoral, the first hotel in America with electric lights. And as Grant gets off the train, he wants to walk up to the front porch of that cottage, and he's so weak that he'll actually stumble. A couple of his escorts will grab him and help carry him up. He's so exhausted, it's 3 days before he's able to come back out. But once he does, he finds himself a nice seat and begins to work. And he will pass the days writing in the mornings, taking a nap, and he'll go over revisions in the afternoons. His voice leaves him at this point. It becomes so hard for him to talk that he'll begin to actually sketch things out on slips of paper. They call it pencil talk, and it's a wonderful gift to us historians because the last 6 weeks of Grant's life are captured in his own handwriting. It's fantastic. He will write, he'll see visitors, and things will go on. And they'll progress smoothly. There are 2 pictures that come out of this period of time. The famous one, him wearing his stocking cap, taken June 27th, working on his memoirs. And then the last picture of him taken on the day he finished, July 20th, 1885. He sets his pencil down, realizing that there's probably more to write. If he had more time, he said more incidents would suggest themselves to them, but he is literally up against the ultimate deadline. And so he finally finishes. To celebrate, everyone's going to go down to this overlook that looks over the Hudson Valley. And it's such an exhausting trip, even though it's just a couple hundred yards, that Grant has to immediately turn around and go back to the house. They get lost in the woods trying to take a shortcut, and Grant goes up into the house, lays down, and he'll never get up again. In fact, he's been sitting in a chair to stay upright so he can breathe. And his condition is so weak, they're actually going to install a bed in the house that he can lay down. And the next couple days will pass, and he will not recover, and his condition will continue to deteriorate. And the family gathers, and they huddle in intense vigil over Grant. I'll skip past the bath chair that got him up to the overlook and back. And as they wait, on the evening of the 22nd, the doctors feel like he's not going to last the night. But Grant does. And at sunrise, Dr. Douglas goes down to the overlook to watch the sun come up over the Hudson Valley. Peaceful, quiet morning. And one of the nurses comes rushing down. Dr. Douglas, quick. And Douglas rushes back up to the house, and Grant is so pale. He is perspiring. His breathing is short and quick and shallow and faint. And Douglas sends word to the family, which scrambles from their bedrooms upstairs, down the stairs, and they gather around Grant's bed. When this bed was installed in this front room, as it happened, there was a portrait of President Lincoln on the wall, and further down the wall, there was a portrait of President Grant. And Grant's bed is set up beneath Lincoln's portrait. And across the room, there's a window that looks out onto that sunrise. And as the sun comes up, a sunbeam comes through the window and casts its light on the picture of Lincoln. And as the sun rises, that sunbeam comes down the wall onto Grant's face. And according to the New York Times, a little breeze rustled the curtain of that window, and Grant woke up with a short flutter. And after a few raspy breaths, and he looked around, and his eyes fell upon Julia, and then closed again. And then it was as though he fell into a deep and restful sleep. And one final flutter of the curtains, and then he was gone. It was 8:08 on Thursday, July 23rd, 1885. He had beat his deadline by 3 days. What's magnificent about this book is that it remains in print. It's never gone out of print. It will earn Julia $250,000 in royalties by the end of its first year. 2 volumes which today still speak to us. And if you've never read Grant's memoirs, I encourage you to, because of their clarity, their insight, and their ability to tell a story from the man who helped save the country. But what I love most about this is that it's a book written by a father and a husband who wanted to take care of his family. He knew he was facing financial ruin. He knew he had no way to care for them after he was gone. And so who among us would not undertake such an endeavor for the ones we love the most? Yes, he had something to say about the war as the man who saved the country, but he had something to do as a father and a husband. That, more than anything else, is a reason to turn back. Thank you very much.